Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm your host, Drew Hanisch, the Amazon bestselling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon, and also the upcoming Travel Guide to Experiencing Irish Whiskey. And today, I want to welcome as my guest, James Doherty. James is the founder of Sliabh Distillers, Ardara Distillery, the producer of Silkie, which is one of the new breeds of Irish whiskey hitting your local whiskey retailer. And James, welcome into the show.
Drew, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, this is great. We had a chance to chat before. I didn't get to meet you face to face when I was traveling across Ireland, unfortunately, because you guys were off in Germany. You and Moira, your wife, and getting people in the world of whiskey to meet you and learn a bit about your brands and what you're doing there. So.
Thank you.
Luckily, we had an opportunity to catch up afterwards, though, when we did our face-to-face on Zoom, which was great. And then, I wanted to have you on the show because you guys, not only is there a history from where your distillery is that I think my listeners will find interesting, but also you're really stretching the idea of what Irish whiskey can be. And so we'll talk a bit about your processes here during the episode and also do a tasting of your Midnight Silkie and talk a little bit about your special ingredient, which is turf or peat. So we'll dive into that. So let's talk about this idea of distilling in Donegal and the fact that Donegal hasn't had a legal distillery since 1841 with the old Burt Distillery. And so talk about that and the fact that you guys are really the first to be to have distilled legally in the area.
Yeah, it's a really interesting place, Donegal, because it's in the very far northwest of Ireland, so it's the most northerly county. We're closer to Belfast than we are to Dublin, so we're sort of geographically in the north of the country, but we're politically in the Republic, and probably what makes us contrary is we're forgotten by everybody. So it's a county of kind of has a kind of interesting attitude to the world, and I kind of describe it as mischief and melancholy. So it's a county where people have left. It's a county where people leave to kind of look for opportunity elsewhere, and that includes my parents who left. My mum left here in 1966, and I grew up in England, hence this sort of British accent, which I'm afraid I can't shake. But I've always considered myself Irish, and if you look at this wonderful county, what you see is it has the most amazing illicit distilling heritage. So, everybody's grandfather would have been a distiller. I think a lot of the kind of continuity has probably been lost now because the current generation, my dad's generation, all kind of are more town-based and it's less rural and alcohol is generally cheaper, so you don't really get that many people making illicit alcohol now. You still do, but not as many. But this county had, if you go back to say 1815, there were more illicit still seizures in Donegal than there were in any other county in the country of Ireland, or on the island of Ireland. And the next nearest would have been Tyrone, which was like 120 or something. So like 4 times as many people were getting caught, which tells you one of two things, or maybe 3 things. But firstly, either they weren't very good at hiding. Maybe they were all at it and they didn't care. And 3, maybe we have better police, I don't know. But I mean, the reality is this is the distilling heartland of Ireland, and the style of illicit stills was smoky, and that's because our primary fuel source is turf, or peat as it would be called in Scottish terms, and that style has kind of fallen away. But the last distillery here was, as you said, was 1841. This distillery in Burt, which is on the road between Letterkenny and Derry, so in the very north of the county. The chimney still stands, so the original still house and chimney is still standing to this day, and it's a beef farm now. So they closed in 1841. They were making light, easy styles. And of course, there was no home market for that. And they weren't big enough to compete with the international guys. So they fell by the wayside. So sort of fast forward, if you think to sort of 2014, Moira and I moved back from Hong Kong to build our own distillery. It was an itch that needed scratching for me. It kind of scared us and excited us at the same level, which is probably a bit like getting on a roller coaster. If it's like that, you've got to do it. So we came back with this intention of reclaiming the distilling heritage of Donegal, putting rural tastes back at the front and centre of what Irish whiskey was and should be. And that meant that we sort of started distilling gin in 2017. Through 2019, we released Silkie as it is now with the Smoky elements to it. And in 2020, during lockdown, found the time to lay down the first single malt whiskey distilled in Donegal legally since 1841, which is a lot of fun.
Well, and we'll dig into a little bit of this firsts idea here in a little bit, but kind of getting back to this idea of distilling in that area and how long this, illicit distilling had gone on. I did an episode actually recently where I was for Whiskey Lore Stories where I was talking about the excise and the history of the excise, and it was an interesting time period in the 18th century or the 17th century. Let's get my centuries right. 18th century, yes. That laws were passed, and they were working to try to. They basically handed it over to the excise to figure out market towns, because they wanted to have market towns be the ones that had the license, so they didn't have to go out and find all these illicit distillers across the countryside. So they wanted to simplify this thing, and in doing that, I think they showed their ignorance to whiskey production and the reason for whiskey production, because the market towns they seemed to develop were a lot in the south where there was a lot of grain. And then in the north, they didn't quite get to the north very easily, so they didn't set up a lot of market towns in the north. And I think this is part of the reason, from what I can see, the idea being, if you have enough grain and you're in a town that has a strong market for grain, you don't need to make whiskey. And this being the reason why Waterford and Kildare and some of these areas didn't really get known for whiskey distillation, whereas you had no market towns really being set up in Donegal, yet here you had all these distillers who couldn't make whiskey because they didn't have a market town near them to legally do it. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why all these distillers went underground.
Yeah, I wonder. I hadn't thought of it like that, but I think also there's the unintended consequences of the taxman getting involved in anything kind of drives very weird behaviour, And if you look at your 3-tier system in America, it's really a product of prohibition, and the consolidation of Irish whiskey probably driven partly by the taxman as much as anything else in Ireland. I think also, if you're a government body, you tend to focus resources, and they still do it today, where they get the biggest bang for their buck. So they kind of rural areas, remote areas, they just get forgotten. They're just put in the too difficult or the too hard box, and then if you look at the distillers that were even sort of my grandfathers and their sort of ancestors, they were all so small that really catching them is almost impossible, because they're remote. They're only doing it up on the hills at between harvest periods, so from July to October before the weather gets too bad, and everyone's in on it. So you're not really going to be able to get into an area and close it down. I mean, if you look at the islands, one of the things, some of the stories about the islands were, there were no guards, there were no police on the island. They were on the mainland, so they had to take a ferry across. But by the time they were on the ferry, everybody knew what was happening, so everything was cleared away and hidden. And so it's kind of one of those strange ones. But I do think that what has happened in Donegal particularly is that most of the players are small. very small, very local, serving local markets. There's probably a survival piece about that, about not getting caught and being good at it. It also probably means you can have copper stills and make better quality poaching rather than kind of using tin stills and kind of poor ingredients, because you're not so worried about getting caught. But we've also, if you look at somewhere like Donegal, the county town really was Derry, and that's when you think about that, that's 2.5 hours drive from where I am now in a car. It might as well be forever away if you go back to sort of the turn of the century. So, and that's the turn of the 19th century rather than
right.
the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But so I think it's an interesting piece where I think the certain behaviour of the taxman has definitely driven away the kind of rural, the sort of small scale rural player into this kind of town based thing. But it's certainly true. If you look at Aeneas Coffey, who invented the column still, he was a tax officer up here in Donegal. He got shot whilst he was up here. But he's quoted as saying that every farmer in Donegal was a full-time distiller and a part-time farmer, and not the other way around, which was what they claimed.
Yeah.
So I think it's for me, it's wonderful. The stories are rich. I have my grandfather's poaching recipe, which we're due to make in a week or so, and it's alien to me that this county with such a rich distilling heritage didn't have any kind of distilling presence at all until we came back. I can't quite understand why someone else didn't think of it first.
Well, and interesting that actually in reading about the Old Burt Distillery, part of the reason why they said it shut down was because of competition from Derry, because Derry had 2 established distilleries and they just couldn't compete with that. And it breaks my heart that I didn't see the chimney or get a chance to or know it was there, because I stayed right down the road from it, right on the border outside of. I was still in Northern Ireland, but I was staying at a bed and breakfast where as soon as I drove down the road, within 2 minutes I was in Donegal. I was in so.
But it's funny because I think that angle of Watts is coming back as well. So we actually had, for example, just shows you, it's kind of a nice collegiate industry at the moment, but the guys that are putting the old Watts brand, which is the Derry brand, back on the map, they were actually down in the Ardara Distillery filming our stills and things yesterday. So they came down because, when you're putting together brochures to raise money and all that kind of stuff, you need kind of sexy looking photos of warm copper things and bubbling things and what have you, and so we said, look, come down, use our distillery. You won't recognise it in the photos anyway. But I think Bert's challenge was that it wasn't making a style that competed with its home market, if you like, its Donegal market. It couldn't, and it was also then not of a scale that could compete on a cost level with Watts and the bigger distilleries in the north, in Coleraine and what have you. So it kind of ended up falling between 2 stools and dying away, which is, I think that's what's happened with quite a lot of those old distilleries. Is the kind of reason for being kind of just petered out, and they were neither scaled or scalable, or sort of small and artisanal and could find their own way, like a Kilbengan would have done.
Yeah. So you've moved forward 175 years, and now all of a sudden we have 3 distilleries in Donegal. So and so it's interesting to see now that rediscovery. There's a slight bit of controversy, which is the idea of who was the first one to distill. Since you're on the show, I'll give you the first opportunity to jump in there and say. First barrel distilled belongs to
Sliabh Distillers. So
okay.
we're the first. It's one of those funny ones. I think it's a product of the kind of relative youth of the. Irish whiskey is interesting because it's like the oldest distilling heritage potentially in the world, and it's also the youngest because it's gone from a super consolidated position to a now 40 odd distilleries in a period of like 10 years. So you kind of look at that and you go, wow. And everybody everyone's trying to give a sense of place, a sense of purpose, and a sense of the kind of right to be there. And so there's always, everybody wants to be the first at something, first or fastest or biggest, and we certainly made the first whiskey in Donegal. We're the first distilling company in Donegal since 1841. We made our single malt in the distillery, which was producing gin in the main. So, we've made tiny quantities of double distilled, ferociously peated single malt. Which comes of age on the 26th of July next year. So that's kind of irrefutable. If you want a purpose-built whiskey distillery, I guess the Crowley guys would say they're the first at that, and they do some interesting things because they've got cognac stills and direct firing, so they're looking at it in a slightly different way. They're unpeated, we're peated. And then in the far north of the county, you've got the Boileauque distillery with Michael O'Boyle up there, and Michael's kind of his scale is substantially smaller than ours and substantially smaller than Crowley, and he has that luxury of being able to make just whatever the hell he damn well pleases where he wants. And that's a fine place to be. So I think we've got three kind of very different models that potentially are all successful for different reasons, and that's really good, because I think Donegal could probably cope with 5, 6, 7 distilleries. That would make us a proper destination. Now, if you put Watts into that in Derry, you kind of go, okay, well that could be one of them. So 3, that's 4.
Yeah, you got Limavady might be happening a little down the road from there.
And if you've got Sazerac just bought Lochgill down in Sligo,
right.
You're starting to pull the gravity, the centre of gravity of distilling away from the south and just a little bit more towards the northwest, and we'll take that.
Yeah. And I love this idea, and this is what I really am trying to get across in the book, is that there are, I count 27 distilleries that I went to that have tours going on right now. I have 24 projects, and I don't have Watts in there. So I have 24 projects that are either the distillery is there and they just aren't doing tours yet. Michael's distillery is a good example of that. Or that are coming down the road. And so, but yet with all of those distilleries, everybody is doing something a little different. The experience at each distillery is a little different, and you're telling different pieces of history, or you are creating whiskeys that use different techniques. Good example of that being when I visited Michael before I came down to your distillery. Okay. I went to Crawley, and then I came back down your way. And when I was there, we were chatting back and forth about the fact that he was thinking about doing grains in distilling. And grains in is something that me, as somebody who's traveled through Kentucky, Tennessee, American distillers do a lot more grain in distilling than in fact, I can't name really any in Scotland that I've bumped into that are doing grains in. I know that there probably are a couple examples, but to hear him say that, and then drive down the road and then find out that you guys are doing it, and so I actually sent him an email just after I had Graham, your distiller, walk us through and tell me everything. I said, you're probably going to get a call from this guy Michael, because he said he just doesn't know how you can do that. And to kind of explain grains in, just for people who don't understand what that means, you're basically, distillers can either take the wort and drain it off, or beer, whatever we want to call it, and drain that off and then distill that, or you can just leave all of the grain and the wort and put that into the still and distill it there, which has all of its own little issues potentially, and so this is why it's not always
it has issues for sure.
Yeah, so you guys have chosen to do grains in. So talk a little bit about that decision, why you decided to do that, and maybe some of those issues that you bumped into.
Yeah, for us it was a really straightforward decision at the beginning. I suppose you need to do something that you're passionate about, first of all, and so it kind of needs to be true to you, but it also needs to be true to the place, our sense of place. And for us, it was really clear that if we were kind of honouring, you stand on the shoulders of, giants like my grandfather, and actually, he was born in 1898 and he was 6'3", so, by that kind of era, he was a big man, a giant, but you're sort of looking at his process, and I'm going, well, if you were in Donegal and you were making whiskey and he came back today, he's been dead a long time now, but if he was, if he came back today, what would he recognize as a distilling process? And he certainly wouldn't recognize a mash tun and clear wort and things like that. So we said, well, if we should be true to this place, and we should try and replicate an illicit distilling process and try and make our whiskies as characterful as possible. So, our contention, and I think it's pretty well documented that Irish whiskey pre-independence, pre-prohibition would have been much richer in style than it is today, and that the kind of taste you have today is a reaction to the kind of dominance of Scotch post Second World War. So if you go back to those flavours of before, they were richer, they were more grain heavy in terms of the grain influence on it, and we felt that we should honour that by making this grains in process. Now for us that means we have a hammer mill, and we turn the grain all heavily peated. So we make a heavily peated single malt, a medium peated single malt, and a heavily peated pot still. And we use a hammer mill to take the malted barley and the grains and smash them down to a sort of 2 millimeter flour. And then instead of going into a mash tun, we have a cooker. So we put it in with the water at 64, and you convert all your sugars into solution. But then at that point, in a proper single malt distillery, a modern kind of single malt distillery, you would then filter that away. So the grain is kept back and fed off to cattle or goes to an anaerobic digester or whatever, and the clear wort goes through the liquid now with all the sugars in it. Whereas we felt like if we had all of the grain, we get all of the character of all of the grain all of the time, because it stays in all the way through to the wash still. So in the fermenters, it does give you challenges, because in the fermenters you've got to have propellers now to keep the grains up in solution the whole time. Because if you switch off, if your wash in the fermenter stops moving, the grain all settles to the bottom, and you can't pump it out. So we've had a whole lot of problems that. To be fair, the guys at Forsyths and my distilling team have been brilliant at just putting their arms around, working it out, scratching their heads a bit. What are we going to do? How are we going to make it work? But we've kind of overcome them now. I mean, we got quite intimate with our heat exchangers, so they used to block up repeatedly, so we had to take them apart all the time to clean them out, which impacts yields and what have you. We have every single non-return valve in the building has been changed 3 times, and this is where going with a distillery manufacturer like Forsyths is really good, because they stay there beside you. You're kind of holding hands going through this together, because the first set of non-return valves blocked. We changed them for some new ones. They also blocked. We then had to send them off to be precision manufactured, and now it all works like clockwork. And interestingly, there are other distilleries who are now trying to do versions of grains in. And if it's a Forsyths distillery, well, the lessons have been learned. So then people are not going to have to wear the scars that we do to get it. But I think what it's helped us do is kind of really understand the process, understand what it is we're trying to do, and it has produced, I would say this anyway, I guess, but it has produced exceptional new make. So we had a group from Germany in yesterday who were just like, I'd buy that today. And, maybe it's a bit too clean, might be the only thing from a blending perspective later, but we get extra sweetness because of the hammer milling and extra smoke. So we get this incredible balance and richness, which is, I suppose there's a bit of luck in there, because we made these calls, and then you kind of you design the thing, and then you just, with Forsyths, you don't really know. The guys, they would tell you don't really know until you start running it through, until you start to get used to your equipment, and you understand it, and you understand the foibles of it. But we're really, really proud of it at the moment. It's making some lovely, lovely whiskies, and that's down to Graham and the guys. I'd love to say it was all down to my genius, but I can tell you it's not. So.
Yeah. Well, you have, I mean, learning on the fly, it's interesting because I mentioned that I couldn't think of any Scotch distilleries that were doing grains in, and you had mentioned that Forsyth actually, this was their first grain in still, and so they were having to learn along, which goes to show this is not a style that you're going to find all over the place in Ireland. In fact, I'll have to ask the guys at Town Branch, which, Pierce Lyons, that's their sister distillery in Kentucky, and they have these two beautiful Forsyth pot stills. But I'm assuming that they actually are not doing grains in on those because, again, they would be Forsyths unless the guys there just knew how to engineer everything to make it work.
Yeah, I think so. Forsyths have definitely put. I think there is one in Scotland. I can't think of the name of it now off the top of my head, but there's certainly Balcones in Texas. Mm-hmm. They have. So our wash still reboiler is kind of modelled on theirs. So they learnt some lessons there, and in fact, I was unsure about the kind of technique that we were doing, and Richard Jr. At Forsyth said, look, give the guys at Balcones a call. Here is the number, and we talked through how it works in practice and kind of what lessons they'd learned from it, and just as kind of the lessons that we've learned will help others, the lessons they learned helped us because they came back and said, well, look, we've had to put in additional valves here and here and here because otherwise this happens, and I kind of went back to Forsyth and said, look, okay, I'm sold, but the guys have flagged this issue up, and no, that's part of the standard design now. So. And that's one of the great things about the industry being as collegiate as it is. Certainly at the technical level, everybody's interested in kind of helping everybody else get off the ground and get it, to get it working. So, I have to say people have been supremely supportive.
Nice. So, in talking about getting turf and being able to malt your barley with it, is that something that is in-house now in terms of, are you getting that from Ireland or is that having to come from Scotland still, or how does that work for you guys?
So we have a mix of both actually at the moment. So the distillery requires 700 tons of malted barley, peated malt a year just to run as it is. And when we go to a third shift, you can add another third onto that. And there isn't a maltster on the island that can cope with that quantity of peated malt. So at the moment, we're having to get it from Scotland. We are sending malted barley over to Scotland. Sending barley from Donegal. So we've, in fact, the farms around the Burt Distillery, the old Burt Distillery. I mean, there's a wonderful kind of sort of serendipitous moment where those farmers have switched out of feed barley into distilling barley and growing it for us and for Crowley, and so that's brilliant because that's getting malted. They're getting more money, but it's also giving us Donegal barley that's either going over to Scotland to be peated for us, or it's being malted on the island unpeated for the guys at Crowley. So that's, we're doing that, and we have sent our turf away to maltsters so that we're getting our own Donegal sort of angle on it. Now, the vast majority of what we produce, in spirit of transparency, is coming out of Scotland using Scottish turf because physically that's all we can do at the moment. But we are working with the maltsters to try and get our turf sent across, applied to it. Waterford have managed to do it. Now, whether they paid an ocean to do it, I don't know. Sadly, I don't have an ocean of money, so I can't do that. But we're working sort of step by step, steadfastly to try and get enough farmers in Donegal to come over to growing distilling barley, and then work with the maltsters to try and get our turf used as well. So, but there's also smaller scale maltsters on the island. So we use Irish craft malts, who use our turf and their barley. They're from Meath, and they'll send that up to us. And they also do, for our pot still, we use malted peated oats as well, which are pretty far out there in terms of style, but it makes the pot still incredible. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that the only other distillery I can think of that does that is Killowen, and I know that because I was there while he was doing it. I'm like, malting oats. I've never really, I've not seen it. I know of some distilleries in the U.S. Usually they're state distilleries that everything is there, and they have their own farm and all of that, and do their own malting Frey Ranch in Nevada is a good example of that, where he has said, and I haven't followed up with him since then, that he's malting just about everything he can, any grain he can, to see what it does. And so it's fun to see this, and this brings up that question of, the pot still regulations and the fact that they're very strict right now. And the question is what you are producing right now, is it technically pot still, or is it technically waiting for regulations to change to be pot still?
Well, I think technically it's pot still, but it's not single pot still. So the technical file and the geographic indication is justifiably strict. I mean, I would be in favour of stricter rules rather than looser rules anyway, because I think it's important that we drive genuine innovation rather than just experimentation. And there's a lot of experiments that get to market, and really I don't think some of them should. So that way, I think putting tight rules on things is a really good way to ensure the kind of longevity of the category. The challenge you have with the pot still file particularly is that the pot still technical file is written and defines single pot still as what is traditional in a modern context. So that arguably that the rules have been written around what is being made today. And when the file was written, 5-6 years ago, it is reflective of the only distillery that was making pot still at the time, which was Middleton, and it is reflective of what they make, and that's kind of fine. But it kind of ignores a whole historical context, which is very different, because it only really reflects that post Second World War style of pot still, rather than the styles of pot still that would have been here in sort of 1900, 1920. I mean, our pot still recipe is a good example. I mean, we've peated it, so it's not the way it was originally, but if we use 50% malt, but ours is peated, 30% raw barley, and then 20% oats, and ours is obviously malted peated oats. So, but that recipe 50-30-20 is pretty close to the original Powers recipe from sort of 1920. So, so you can see how that's an authentic recipe. And Boann has, with Finan O'Connor for part of his work, has investigated all these historic mash bills, and you're seeing that kind of come. Everyone's doing that. Peter Mulryan down at Blackwater, he's resurrecting a lot of these old mash bills, bringing them back, and as you kind of pointed out at the beginning, everyone's kind of doing a little bit different, doing something of their own. For us, we've kind of, rather than try to look at lots of different recipes, you've seen the plant, the distillery's a bit too big to have too much flexibility in it. So we don't have that luxury that say Boeliok or Blackwater would have, or Killowen would have, and or even down at Shortcross, down at Radaman Estate there, David Boyd Armstrong doing some fantastic things. He's pretty quiet about what he's doing, but he's got some pretty cool stuff going on there. So, but it is a kind of, we're technically non-compliant today, so I'm not GI'd for pot still. My belief is that there's pretty much, it's very, very seldom you get real consensus between all the distillers, but there's absolute consensus really on what the new recipe kind of restrictions should be, and the sort of preferred wording I think is sort of 30-30-30, so at least 30% malt, at least, and up to sort of 30% unmalted barley, and up to 30% other grains. And it covers that definition, pretty well covers all of the historic mash bills that would ever have been done. And I think the way the submission is going is that it will be on using only grains that are kind of historically been used. So rye, wheat, maize, but you're not going to be allowed to use quinoa or something like that. So I think it needs to be historically authentic and I think that's a really strong place for it to be. Now that needs to get consulted. It'll take a while. My hope and I guess my belief is that it'll be, by the time we come to market, it will have changed. And if it doesn't, we'll have a lot of fun marketing it as something that it is, but it isn't allowed to be.
Yes, the renegade version. So, and it's funny to watch this going on in Ireland. It shows you how fast the whiskey industry is growing right now, because in the United States, we're going through the same thing with American single malt. And there's consensus amongst many. Of course, we got a lot more distillers, 2,000 plus distilleries across the country. And, of course, not all making American single malt, but the ones that are making American single malt all are going to have kind of their own thing that they would like to probably inject into the standard. But there seems to be a consensus amongst most, with just a couple of outliers. The trouble is just getting it through the process and getting the word that, yes, it's done, and now we can move forward on it. It seems like it takes forever.
Well, I think the trouble with, and it's not, so that's probably the wrong way to start the answer, but government bodies, by definition, are risk averse, and they have to consult, and the number of bodies and things that they have to consult. So one thing getting alignment in the industry, but then you have to go out and consult and make sure that every stakeholder, and interestingly, very often not including the consumer, but every other stakeholder gets consulted, and you get views coming in from left field and that maybe don't chime with what everybody else is thinking, and so you end up with the whole process getting slowed down, and I think that the key bit is getting the principles right. So agree on the big things, get broad agreement on that, and get everybody aligned around that, and then get into the sort of technical stuff at a level below that, because which comes to when it's being implemented and inspected. Because if you do it all in that top line document, you can create just a behemoth that you can never really. It's just it has arms and legs everywhere, and you just really can't get a grip on it. And everyone then has a view on every single detail. So it's kind of a challenge. I don't envy any of those kind of bodies that are trying to pull those things together, but and they can't actively work. They can't physically work fast enough. Yeah. To keep up with the kind of innovative minds that are. And some of our innovative minds are driven by cash. We're just, you've got to drive, you're trying to drive your business forward all the time. You haven't got time to sit there and wait. So we kind of test, learn, refine and do it again, and test, learn and refine. They don't have that luxury, because something like a GI in Europe is going to go through 27 different countries and get agreement with that. And I guess with the US, you've got the TTB, and it's got an agreement across the states and all the distilling bodies. And yeah, it's not a game I want to play.
Just let it happen, and we'll fit in where we can. So let's talk about peated whiskey, and or we call it peated. Do you have a term for it? You wouldn't call it turfed whiskey, would you?
I wouldn't use turf, but I know guys that do, and actually, so I think we don't really refer to peat as a thing here. So we would talk about turf. We're going up to the bog to cut turf. You don't talk about going up to cut peat. Yeah, it is the same thing, but we would talk about turf. And for me, I tend to try and focus on the output rather than the input. So turf is an input, and the output is the smoky flavour it gives us. And so I like to refer to sort of smoky levels of smokiness and styles of smoke. We produce kind of heavily smoked, Irish whiskey, and in the Silkies we kind of take you on a journey from from an introduction to smoke to something quite a little bit more challenging, like the Midnight that we'll have a go at later. So, but I think it's I think the Scots guys have been so good about sort of owning peat, and then this kind of very narrow definition of all Scotch is double distilled and peated, and all Irish is triple distilled and unpeated. Right. And neither of those things are true. So you anytime someone says it to me, I kind of go, okay, here we go. Yeah, double distilled in Scotland in the main, but not always, and Irish triple distilled in the main, but not always. And actually, the thing that amazes me about peat in terms of Scottish whiskey is I think it only accounts for 15% of the total category, and yet it kind of dominates the thinking. And for us, the idea was that we don't even need to be 15% of the category of Irish whiskey to be successful.
Yeah.
So even if we were 1 or 2%, that would be beyond our wildest dreams. And if you kind of hold that the idea of smoky Irish whiskey would have the same kind of strength of idea as peated Scotch, then that's a kind of highly distinctive place, very true to what Donegal would have been, and a place where we could build a sustainable, robust business that would create opportunity in this area for a long, long, long time.
I think what's fascinating as I dig in and do my research on Ireland and try to tell the story of Irish whiskey and its history is the ties between Ulster and Donegal, along with the Western Isles of Scotland and the Kintyre Peninsula. They're so interwoven. There was so much trade going on. Dalriada was the original name for the area or the kingdom that was basically on both sides. It was Scotland and it was Ireland, and the personalities are. I mean, it's funny, when I was in Northern Ireland, at times you almost feel like you're in a Scottish kind of a atmosphere. It's not that far different. And what's interesting too is when I was doing my research on the spelling of the word whiskey, I found that Ulster was an area that spelled without an E, whereas the rest of Ireland spelled with an E. So the idea being that even in that way, they kind of leaned more in with their brothers from Scotland than they did with the rest of Ireland.
Also, we're probably a bit more contrarian. There's a great word used around here, and I know it's used up in the sort of glens of Antrim as well, which is thran. We're sort of stubborn and don't like to be told what to do. And the E, I think, is almost used interchangeably. I mean, you probably know better than me, and I think it's for me, it's not important. Is where I come out on it. So I know for some people it's. I can see on like Facebook when we release something, and ours will have an E, so we don't get. I don't get beaten up for not using an E. But you see something come out from a distillery that just says whiskey with a Y, and it's like, well, no, it's got no E, so it's not Irish. And then we produce ours, and they say, look, it's a smoky Irish whiskey, and they say, if it's smoky, it's Scotch, and it's like, okay, and you get, there's kind of, for me, I think it's interchangeable. From our perspective, it's not an important. For us, it's not an important conversation. I know for other guys it is, and that's fine. That if it's important to them, then they should fight for it. But it isn't important for me, and so for us, it's easier to anchor. We're already contrary when it comes to sort of a little bit at odds with the category because of what we make.
Yeah.
So, me making, then rooting ourselves in something that's perceived as being outside the category even further is probably not helpful. So, it's a kind of slightly more logical, kind of practical decision for us, which is it's not an important fight for us. I'm not going to die in a ditch over an E. So, we use it, but we challenge the category in other ways.
Well, that was an interesting conversation I had with Peter Mulryan, because at Blackwater, he was on the fence. He wasn't sure whether he was going to do the E or not do the E. He went without the E, but as we were talking about it, he said the only reason why I hedge against not having that E in there is because I want the conversation to be about the whiskey, not about the E. And I totally understand that. That actually was the thing that made me go, okay, I need to stop obsessing over this letter. If you go to Scotland, they do obsess over it, and they will, make it a point. But it's actually written into their laws that it has to be spelled without an E. So I think that's part of the defensive-ness on it, is that, hey, by law, you shouldn't be spelling it that way.
It's interesting. I think also the category of Ireland in Irish whiskey is growing so fast that the kind of focus, particularly for sort of the IWA that's protecting, kind of trying to free up markets and open markets and things like that, the whole focus is less about control, I think, and it is more about opportunity. Whereas the SWA is such a big prize, the Scotch whisky industry is such an enormous prize that it's very easy for people to tap into and just take a little chunk of it. And so the SWA is very, very draconian in its approach and its thinking, because it has such big stakeholders that it suits them to have the rules set up in that way, because it makes it increases kind of cost of entry. It makes it easier to defend. It makes it so it's a much more defensive position rather than a more of an opportunity focused position, which I think is where Irish whiskey has the luxury of being currently.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about peated whiskey and the perception you've had. You've only been doing tours here for a couple of months, so you're kind of getting that first wave of people coming through. Normally when you go to distilleries that have a smoky, they usually have a non-smoky option as well. You guys are not doing that, which and there is that opinion already that Irish whiskey is not supposed to be peated, that people are coming across with that idea. And so have you had to kind of walk people into understanding smoky whiskey and how to approach it, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think what we've done is, actually our story is probably easier because we only do one thing. So it's very easy for us. It's a straightforward conversation that says, the minute you walk through the door of the distillery, it smells smoky. It's as simple as that. There is, you walk into reception and you can already smell it, and it's like, we don't have, like I say, Great Northern, where they maybe make a month's worth of peated whiskey, and then they have to spend probably 9 months trying to get rid of the smell for the rest of the whiskies. I don't know, but for us, it is what it is. That is the smell of the area. It is what we love, and the challenge that we've had is, the first one you get is that it isn't that Scotch, and it's like, well, no, this is absolutely true to the Ulster style and Greater Ulster. So Ulster including Donegal, Cavan, Monaghan, the whole of Ulster, not Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. But really, if you look at the history of Irish whiskey, malt whiskey was produced in the north, and pot still was very much of the south. And when I say south, I mean anything other than Ulster, and that's. So what we're doing is saying, actually, you're just, this is what it was, and we're bringing it back, and people go, okay, I get that, and they were happy to play with you then. You walk into the main distillery bit, and it smells, you get that peat smoke smell, it's all around you. I mean, there's all of the kind of distillery smells you would normally get, but it's kind of amped up with this kind of peat smoke piece. What we then do is show them the malted barley that's not unpeated and peated, and say, well, this is the taste of a city, and they kind of get it, and you say it smells like Weetabix, and then you give them the peated stuff, and you kind of go, look, this smells like you're sitting beside the fire with my granddad, and he's smoking his pipe, and they all kind of go, I get it, all right, I know, and they're there. So the next challenge we have is that their perception of smoky whiskies is driven by Islay, and they say, well, I don't like Islas, and you kind of go, that's fine, we have a completely different set of cuts that mean we have a dry, smoky, sweet pipe tobacco smoke aroma. It's kind of ashy, campfirey, and it's all together more welcoming and more approachable. And when we get downstairs to the tasting, we're able to demonstrate that, and we can demonstrate it in the new make. We can demonstrate it in the Silkies, the blends that we produce that already tell you that story. And I think there is a kind of hunger for. The moment that the world is still in a kind of discovery phase, even though it feels a little bit insecure at the moment, but there is this kind of people looking for new things, looking for new tastes, exploring, wanting to discover. And when you're saying, here's something to discover, it's historically authentic, and it's, and not only that, it tastes divine, then it's not the hardest sell, if I'm honest. So yeah. The challenge is getting people past the
iodine kind of medicinal kind of experience that you get out of an Isla kind.
We could make you that,
Yeah.
So if you go, if you're on this, if you taste at the intermediate still, and if you taste on the spirit still, we could cut way lower and create I could make you an Isla style if you wanted. We cut sort of 82 to 70 on the single malt and 82 to 67 on the pot still, and we could make, if we went beyond 67.5, we get down into those iodine seaweedy kind of taste, but we choose not to, and that's the thing. It's just a choice.
Yeah. Well,
and it's gone down well so far.
it's interesting to me that as I've tried to introduce people to smoky whiskeys, the ones that I do from Scotland, one is an Isla, which is Bruichladdich. They actually get their malting and the malting is done in Inverness, so it actually has a little bit more of a foresty kind of a autumn kind of yeah. And people are much more accepting of that, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things as well that the more there's a certain amount of if I bracket whiskey into kind of there's almost a snobbery that goes around. Have you made it to Isla yet? In taste terms, you don't have to physically make it there. And if you haven't, you kind of get that bless, tap you on the head. Never mind, you'll get there in the end, kind of thing. And that's a really useful angle in terms of talking about smoky whiskies as an interesting space. But it doesn't need to be that hard. And actually, the worst thing is if your first experience of a smoky whiskey is a kind of a sort of that carbolic-y soap Isla type taste, or that heavily iodine-y, it's tastes like a sticking plaster. And I love Islas, so don't think I'm being nasty about them, but it does have that kind of elastoplast, sticking plaster smell. If that's your first experience of it and you're quite new to the whiskey world and you haven't really explored kind of places where there's as much challenge, it's just not that sort of challenge, then you kind of immediately kind of draw a line. You kind of go, that's not for me. It's just like, I do tequila, but I don't do mezcal. And it's like, no, you just haven't found the right one yet. And I think that's the thing, is trying to help people, give them the confidence to come and play with you, and then play in a space, and for us that space is kind of warm, welcoming, rich, but it's challenging. Donegal's not an easy place. It's wild. The climate is pretty hard, and people eke a living out, in the area we live, from poor soils. The agricultural environment is not strong, so people have to make a go of it, and they have to be resourceful and resilient, and so that needs to come through in what we do.
Well, and you were the first distillery that I came across. There are probably others now, but you were the first one that I came across that was doing pot still and peated, which I fell in love with the pot still style, and I've been promoting it wherever I can, because to me, I think it's Ireland's secret weapon, that it is just a style that if you are into that grain flavor and that peppery note that comes in on the end, and now we're going to infuse this in with this, with peat. Very, very interesting and very bold whiskey. I mean, it's just very nice body to the whiskeys. And so because you said that pot still is really more of a southern style, what brought you into the idea of doing a pot still up there?
I think what brought us into the style is exactly what you just said. It is Ireland's secret weapon. For me, the fact that there is an indigenous style that is unique to Ireland. I'm not sure, if I'm honest, that the word pot still is the most helpful in terms of, like, single malt tells you what it is.
Yeah.
Pot still tells you it's made in a pot. It doesn't really, so I think there's a language piece that has to be solved, and there's a lack of availability of the kind of wider styles that kind of brings people in. And it's at the moment, because of its rarity, pot still is still ferociously expensive in the main, and not widely understood. And I think So I was convinced that we should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. I mean, our production is probably 70% single malt, 30% pot still, and that's probably a reflection of how big the opportunity is. You know, single malt is seen as the pinnacle of whiskey making, and you know it's that virtuoso, you know, instrument being played to the best it can be. That's what it is, and that's widely understood. In Asia, it's particularly well understood. So from just a naked commercial proposition, you've got to do it.
Yeah.
You know, that's so. You know, from a business perspective, it's a play that you've got to play. Now there are distilleries that haven't, and that's brave in my view. That's really courageous. But then you come back to, well, what is Irish? You know, what is synonymous with Ireland? And actually, pot still is unique. Well, it is distinct. There's very little in the world that's unique. Yeah. So it is, you know, it is distinctive. It is rooted in place, and a pot still from Donegal would be, you know, for me is an interesting thing that we should be trying to develop. My challenge is, can the category grow fast enough for it to become a more, I want to say mainstream, I don't mean mainstream as in pricing, but I mean it becomes a more widely accepted kind of concept and language within the whiskey world, because I just don't think it's there at the moment.
Well, I'll tell you from my own experience. I did an interview probably about 8 months ago, before I got in and really started to understand what pot still whiskey was, because I have to say I am new to Irish whiskey. The Irish whiskey that I drank, I didn't really like so much, which were some of the more popular brands that I'm just like, I'm not really getting this. And it was part of my idea of going to Ireland and going to all these different distilleries to learn, because I had the same thing with bourbon. When I went across bourbon country and went to the different distilleries, suddenly bourbon made sense to me. It's like, I know what this is. I know where it comes from. I have a better understanding of it. And I was doing a interview with a brand out of Chattanooga, Tennessee called J.W. Kelly, and he came from Waterford, and they were one of the largest distilleries in Tennessee, if not the largest distillery in Tennessee in the 19th century. And so this woman's doing this research. She's digging through all of the different information, and she sent me. She said we, because she was trying to write a Wikipedia page about them, and one of the things said that they were the biggest pot still whiskey distiller in Tennessee, and so she saw the pictures that showed a pot still, and so the connection was made, and she said, it was the only pot still whiskey distillery in Tennessee. Now this is the 19th century. And there's no way, with the amount of distillers that were in Tennessee at that time, that they were the only pot still distillery. I'm going, that doesn't make sense to me. And it wasn't until I put two and two together and said, came from Waterford, he's making pure pot still. Now all of a sudden that word pure is standing out to me, and I'm going, oh, he's talking about a style. He's not talking about what he's making it in. So you're right. I mean, that is a real challenge, even to somebody like me who is digging into the history. I saw, somebody had to point out that Redbreast is pot still style whiskey. And I think what people don't understand about pot still, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I get this feeling like 12-year-old Redbreast might not be the best version of Redbreast. In other words, if they didn't age it quite that long, it might be actually even more interesting, because the longer it sits in that cask, the more it's taking on the wood characters and kind of flattening the whiskey out, versus if it could be much more robust in a earlier age.
And partly, I kind of wonder whether that's as a result of, big companies having to manage portfolios.
Yeah.
If you've got multiple brands, it's you look at Diageo and you look at all of those distilleries. Well, they can only have so many classic malts. They can't really do everything everywhere, and so they're forced to make choices. And if you look at the way IDL kind of run their portfolio, it's quite clear they all have very sort of definitive roles within there. And for me, Powers, which is largely pot still, has also got kind of its identity is probably the least well defined of those great brands that they have in that house. And so I think the challenge is that the sort of growth of Jameson has been is really a machine that has kind of, and as that super tanker that's kind of developed a swell in Irish whiskey, which is amazing. The other brands kind of have remarkable, like Redbreast is kind of held in remarkable esteem. It's like a Macallan of or a Springbank of the Irish world, but it's kind of also not. It doesn't have to be as much, or it hasn't had to be as well defined because it is so distinct within the portfolio as it sits at the moment. But that probably means that has it maxed out its opportunity? I'm not sure. I think you could do more with it, and you could do different things with it. But then you're competing for resources within a much bigger portfolio, and that's a kind of different conversation.
I was wondering too if maybe the reason why they landed on 12 years was to be seen as premium and to compete in the Scotch world. And I talked on this podcast with John Campbell, who was at Laphroaig, and Laphroaig 10 is their flagship. But as I talked to him, as he's working at his new distillery, I said, "What's your favorite age for Laphroaig?" And he said, 8 year. He said, it's just right on the spot where it needs to be. But there's this perception that a Scotch can't be really good unless it's had 12 years in a barrel.
No, definitely. And I mean, if you look at our the way we've modelled out our business, we've modelled it accurately for sort of 10 years and then sort of a little bit more loosely for the next 10. I see the pot still at 8 years when it's at its signature style. So I'm with you. The challenge is Johnny Walker 12 is kind of, Johnny Walker Black has established 12 years old as the definitive age for sort of premium, what should be a sort of premium category. I was at Glenfiddich, for years. I spent, a long time with William Grant and Sons and Balvenie. I was there when Balvenie 10, the Founders Reserve, was obsoleted, and Balvenie 10 was a lovely whiskey, and it's the biggest single malt markets for us were the US, and the US was a 12-year-old market. That was the kind of way it was played, so it was like, no, if you're not 12-year-old, you're no one. So the 10-year-old kind of was pulled. I don't even know if it's still in the UK, but it was in the UK for a little while afterwards, because the UK was definitely 10 was the standard, the sort of single malt standard age. But 12 has kind of become, throughout the emerging markets, that's the age that everyone associates with things almost coming of age, or coming of luxury.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somehow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a tough one, because it certainly isn't, in my view, it certainly isn't where some whiskies are at their best, for sure. And certainly I kind of think that, as I said, the pot still will be ready. Our signature pot still style will be ready, and it will be a blend of between 5 and 8 year old whiskies in there. That's kind of how I see it. And actually the Silkies, we try and get balance and softness, and we get that from whiskies that are 3 to 4 years old. These are not old whiskies that we're using, partly because in Irish whiskey, if you use old variants, older liquids, they are harder to source, they're harder to get. The quality can be variable, so it's kind of a challenge to find the right components. Whereas this way, we've kind of elected to go this route because it allows us to get consistency of supply and allows us to create the flavors the way we want them to be.
Yeah. And so this is, we're going to do a tasting of the Midnight Silkie, but before we jump into doing that, we lost somebody this a few weeks or so ago, who we talk about. This whiskey is being sourced from Great Northern, and before we chatted before on our talk a few weeks ago, we were talking about the importance of Brian Watts and what he has brought to the Irish whiskey industry, and he sadly passed away not too long ago. Can you kind of give me your feelings about, because I know he was working very closely with you in trying to get Silkie put together, and kind of the relationship you had?
Absolutely. Well, I knew Brian since 1998, actually. So he was at Girvan, the Glenfiddich, not Glenfiddich, but the William Grant's big grain plant when I joined Grant's years and years ago, and we kind of went our separate ways, and then came back together in 2019 to sort of work on Silkie and blending Silkie together. And Brian, he was only 60 when he died, which is just too young for anyone to go, frankly. He was a remarkable character in terms of his generosity of spirit, and his generosity of insight. He was willing to spend time and share, and helped. He helped put blends together for lots of people. Now there are some people who just wanted him to create a blend for them, and then they kind of rubber stamp it, and he was absolutely, could do that front and center. He was also looking at different styles, so he was making different things, finishing different things, and for us, as someone who kind of wants to build our own blend but needs access to these things, he was amazing. He would just open the lab up and leave me playing with 22, maybe even more whiskies than that, just on a big, all the way around the lab. And he would leave me there for a couple of hours and then come back and say, right, James, where have we got to? And we'd get the structure. I can get the structures right, and I can get the balance pretty close. But he always had this really deft touch for just that little bit of something that just set it off, lets you get that kind of the little shine that you needed on it, or just took that little spike away. And he was brilliant about, we'd kind of get things as good as we could get them, and then you'd come back sort of 3 months later and say, we did that, Brian. It's got a bit of a spike here, mate. I'm not sure about this. And then we'd get, we'd work again. So he was, his fingerprints are on a lot of whiskies out there at the moment. And his team, the team he built at Great Northern, that will continue on. It's a young, talented team. So his legacy is really, really big, really heavy. And he wouldn't have said that himself, because he was just far too modest, and just getting him into a photo was painful. He wasn't big on standing there and having his photo taken. It wasn't one of those kind of celebrity distillery managers, but he's no less for being the quieter man, and the industry owes him a big debt of gratitude, and John Teeling for bringing him in. John had the vision to build that Great Northern business, which is a powerhouse engine for the business, for the industry. But it took someone like a Brian to be that catalyst for a lot of those brands.
Yeah, I only got a chance to meet him one time, but I can tell you he left an impression on me, and I talked about him everywhere I went, because I knew everybody on the island knew him anyway, because so many people had dealt with him. How many distilleries I visited that their, some portion of their whiskey may have been sourced from there, or a handful of other distilleries. And he, what was interesting about our day was that it started out, and we clicked on the Scotland thing right away, because, I had been to Scotch whiskey distilleries. This was one of the first Irish whiskey distilleries I'd been to, and I suddenly felt at home. He was like a bridge between the Scotch whiskey industry to the Irish whiskey. It's like he could translate things for me so that I could get more comfortable with what Irish whiskey was. And then I mentioned that I enjoyed rye whiskeys, and his eyes lit up. And he went over and he immediately grabbed a bottle of something that he had been working on for somebody that was a rye and sherry finished whiskey. And I tasted it. We're sitting there talking about it. I'm like, wow. I mean, I just love the inventiveness of this. And he said, that's what I'd love to do. And then took me down into the blending lab and was just trying to wow me with different things, and say, what do you like? And I go, well, I had that Jameson's cask finish. I thought the stout version, I was kind of disappointed in it. It was like I wanted something a little bit more out of it. And he goes, here, let me blend you up something. And he blends something up, and it's like, I said, this is like campfire marshmallows, but also has, and that chocolate and the things that you expect kind of out of a stout were coming through on it. I'm like, okay, you definitely know what you're doing and has had such a passion for it.
No, he did, and he was just brilliant and as I say, for me, it's that kind of generosity of spirit, kind of reflective of, that's not often, it's not common, and to find it, and to be welcomed, no matter how painful we were being. He always had that patience and the kind of goodwill to kind of work it through, and you, as you say, he was making it lots and lots of different styles of whiskey. I mean, the interesting thing I think as well is, he brought a Scottish approach to distilling. So there's a very specific idea about how you make triple distilled in Ireland, and it's not the same in Scotland. So there's a difference in terms of how you make, to get to that lighter style, that involves a different use of sort of spirits, different use in terms of the way you move spirit from each still to the next in a triple distilling piece. Now we run very similar to the way Brian would, which probably reflects my kind of experience in Scotland and Graham's experience in Scotland. So we have a balanced system, and so does Great Northern. But whereas if you were at Bushmills, they make a slightly different style and way of doing it, and that creates a higher ABV in that spirit style and a lighter style, which is fine. It's, each to their own.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think was really useful to us was it kind of verified some of the things we were thinking of doing. And Brian, you could phone him up at any time and just say, I'm looking at this. You could phone him up and say, I've just done this. And he said, I'll just send me down a sample. I'll put it through the GC machine, and I'll send you the readings. And so, that kind of, it's uncommon to find that kind of generosity, and he'll be remembered fondly for a long, long time because of it.
Well, I heard you pouring a glass. We'll just raise a glass to it. How about that?
Yeah. There we go.
So, talk a little bit about Silkie, and first of all, the name. Where does the name come from?
So the Silkie or Selkie legend is the mermaid legend of the west coast of Ireland, and so there she is. It was brought to us by the Vikings, so it's potentially it's not an original one from here. But Donegal, the word Donegal, actually, if you go back to the Irish, is Donegal, which means the fort of the stranger or the land of the stranger, and that's because as an area it was settled by Pictish, by Vikings, we have a Spanish influence as well as the Celts. So it's an interesting kind of place in that sense. But the Little Mermaid or the mermaid legend comes down the west coast of Scotland in Kelpies, who lure you to the rocks to your death, which is not very nice. But then in Ireland we have Silkies or Selkies, and they lure you to fishing grounds. But they come ashore it's a seal who comes ashore. She sheds her seal coat and becomes a beautiful woman, falls in love with a fisherman, has a family before the call of the sea becomes too much, and she has to go back. And if you go out in a fishing boat around here now, if a seal follows you, it's believed to be good luck because the Silkies are looking after you. Interestingly, if you go all the way to Nova Scotia, the same legend exists.
Wow.
So they have Silkies or Selkies over there. So that's why the Silkie name is on there, and it's a nice play on words, which kind of is
absolutely
a happy accident.
Yeah, because I was sort of thinking, was that what we were talking? Because I've had peated whiskeys that are silky on the palate.
Yeah. And I suppose we don't look for silky per se. I have a particular fashion that I love, or a particular thing I love, which is soft drinking hard spirits. I love drinks that are soft on the tongue. So I don't like to feel, when you're drinking and tasting, I don't like to feel it on the outside of my tongue. I don't like that steely, flinty kind of texture that you get, a kind of hardness, if you like, which is, when you see guys drinking a beer in a chaser, and they kind of drink a bit of their beer, and then they knock the chaser back, and then they get that shudder, and that shudder leaves me cold, but that shudder is what they want, and I don't like that, so we specifically blend to have this kind of, so you should get it at the front of your tongue, and then sort of almost like a blanket down the middle of your tongue, rather than on the outside. So that's a softness that we look for, which I guess you could call silky if you wanted to play with it.
Yeah.
So,
For me, mouthfeel is one of the things that really it's the reason why I don't really put ice in my glass. I just got so, it's like one piece that is completely missing if I do that. In fact, the only thing I usually ice down would be maybe a cask strength bourbon, something that is going to be aggressive on the tongue, and I feel like maybe I'll or if it's summertime and I just feel like icing something down. I like to say I started out my whiskey journey, my return to my whiskey journey, by drinking Macallan 12 on ice, which likely probably annoys a lot of Scottish people, but that was all the only way I really could handle it early on. It helped me walk me into the flavor, watered down as it was. But then once I discovered mouthfeel, boy, it's like I don't want to give that up.
Yeah, I think the interesting about sort of Macallan, sort of late 90s, was really sweet. I mean, it was very, very much sweeter than I think it is today, and I think ice would have just knocked the edge off that sweetness as well. You know, I personally drink if I'm drinking for pleasure, I drink with ice, but lots of ice. I don't want it to dilute.
Yeah.
I just want it cooled down. And if I'm honest, I think the Silkies are probably a little bit sweeter than they need to be. But that's because we drink them with ice, and so if you that ice just knocks down that sweetness just a fraction and allows you to do things with it. But I have, I suppose, my reaction to drink it however you like.
Right.
I really don't mind. For me, in fact, it's not that I don't mind. I don't care. I just want you to enjoy it and come back and buy another.
Very nice. Very nice. That's the commercial side of you coming out.
Well, and the commercial side of us is we have good mouthfeel because we bottle at 46%, so we don't chill filter. And I'd love to tell you there's some honourable decision behind that, but it's a chill filtration unit's a lot of money, so we don't have it.
Okay, that works.
so we've bottled at 46, but actually, what we love is that mouthfeel, that texture.
Yeah.
And they're all natural colour, all the Silkies. So they're all natural colour, non-chill filter. The Midnight Silkie, which you've got there, is the smokiest in the range. So it's like a journey in smoke. They're all the range. There's three of them explore different ideas of smoke. And the Midnight Silkie is called such because it's really the one for the end of the evening. That kind of richness. 35% of the blend is peated, so triple distilled, heavily peated Great Northern single malt. The structure, the kind of sweetness and the backbone of it is created by Cabernet Sauvignon casks, unpeated, and imperial stout, oatmeal imperial stout casks.
Okay.
Which I was hoping would give us kind of a chocolatey taste, but I think they give you more sort of creamy mouthfeel.
Yeah. So I get a lot of the like pear note comes through, and the orchard fruit, a little bit of oak. But the thing I had the most trouble with in terms of nosing this was, and you can see by the bottle that I have experimented a bit with this since, because I kept trying.
You haven't been shy about it.
I kept trying to figure out how do I define this smoky character that's coming out, and the best I could say was that it was like an earthy, peppery smoke.
Okay, yeah. So the earthiness I definitely get. I think it's a little bit meaty. It's got an earthiness which is a bit campfire-ish.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit barbecue-y almost.
Yeah, but I get that hint of like a black pepper that just is like, it just blends with the smoke. It's a character in the smoke that, and it's not that I've ever been around, and this is why I had a hard time saying it, because I'm thinking, well, where the heck do you ever have peppery smoke? That's not something that, but it's just kind of a blending of those two scents into one thing, which is interesting to me.
I think Talisker has a kind of pink peppercorn kind of in its smoke, for me anyway. But you get a kind of apple note on all of our on all of the Silkies, and so for me, for this one, it's almost like a toffee apple. We're coming into Halloween, so it's kind of highly appropriate. But that red toffee, and then you crunch through into the freshness of the apple inside. It's kind of, I get that, and then it's got that kind of straw-like biscuitiness to it, and then there's sort of those Christmas spices, so a bit like sort of figs and sort of raisins cooked in butter kind of thing.
Yeah,
that kind of when you're preparing a Christmas cake, I get that out of it. So
it's interesting on the palate that it. I get what you're saying about the creaminess, because it's almost like after you drink a Guinness, and it's that first sip of the Guinness, and you got a lot of the head of the beer, that it kind of coats your tongue, and that's kind of the experience that I get out of it. I also do get a dark chocolate note that just lays on the top of my palate. It's not overly out front, but I think the reason that it kind of hides is because that toffee and smoke grabs your attention. The sweetness of that grabs your attention initially, and I think it throws you off from what would be kind of more of a bitter dark chocolate note, but it's not necessarily highly bitter. It's just a touch of that.
Yeah, no, I get that. I get what you're saying. Interesting. I hadn't. Now that you've suggested chocolate, I'm getting chocolate.
That's the fun of hearing other people talk, and all of a sudden, it's awareness. I used to go, I don't want to tell people, I don't want to put things in their head, but with people who have good palates, and it's fun to talk about those things and throw them out there and have somebody go, oh wow, I didn't make that, because like butterscotch is one of those notes that I never really define until somebody points it out, and then I go, oh yeah, that's in there.
And interestingly, the original, the legendary Silkie, the first one in the range, I mean, I used to call it butterscotch, but I describe it as buttered popcorn now, because I think people find that image quicker than butterscotch, because it's not, butterscotch is almost like an old-fashioned taste somehow. And I think a little bit of water just opens this up as well. And gives you, allows you to get into those characters. It's better if it warms, and I know if I was writing tasting notes, it is a drop of water and let it warm up. But for pleasure, it's always going to be ice. And at cask strength, the chocolate definitely comes out. You definitely get it at that. But that's 59%, and that's kind of high. But that, I think my feeling is that the high ABV can be carried because the softness of the spirit allows you to. So even at 60%, they drink, but they don't drink spiky. They drink warm, and they drink, you need to put something in it. And I was talking to a guy the other day, and he reckoned that our whiskies, that he thinks that they drink really well at sort of 51, 52. And I was like, yeah, I get that. I know if you get a cask strength and you take it down to that, that's really cool. But there isn't a business case that makes that work. Yeah.
Well, if you had the bottled in bond law over there, where you had to have it at exactly 100 proof, then you'd be in on that. You could label it that way. But
we don't have that rule, but we did. For a long time, my mum was actually helping doing the labelling, and so we were tempted at one point to put bottled under parental supervision. On the back label, but I'm not sure that it had a legal definition. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the distillery itself, and people having the ability to come up and visit. You're right on the main line. I almost, and we'll talk about the town as well, because I planned Ardara as the place that I was going to stay, and then I had you on my map to go to Carrick, which is where you used to be, which is down by the actual Sliabh League cliffs. Yeah. And so I was planning all that out. I don't know what. Oh, I know what it was. I went out to the car park where I had parked, and I saw what looked like a distillery off in the distance. I saw pot stills, and I went, am I in the wrong place? And then, come to find out, your Google Maps, I guess, are now corrected. But at one point, you were pointing to down in that direction.
Yeah, and it's funny because Google does. I suppose this is one of the challenges with AI. It decides where you're based. So even though we had a distillery set up and had a postcode and everything else, it decided that our head office. Well, the site in Carrick, we had the gin distillery based there from 2017 until last year. We moved the gin still down to Ardara because of the requirement for space. So the growth of Silkie has meant that we need more space in Carrick for bottling and the administration team. So we've moved all of our distilling operations to Ardara. But the Carrick site is still there. It's just a bottling and administration piece. But Google, for whatever reason, decides that. So we've renamed everything now. It should all have updated. But we still get, if someone's coming to visit, I always send them the air code now, because if otherwise they go to the wrong site. So if you Google, I think if you go to Apple Maps, it takes you to the old site. If you use Google now, it takes you to the new site. So it's it's one of those frustrations. But the site, the Ardara Distillery is, it's in the village. I mean, it really is right. You don't often get a site that close to the village. Normally industrial places tend to be moved out further. So we're very lucky in that sense. And with the car park that you were sat in, we haven't got it yet, but we'll ultimately have a pedestrian bridge that will take you from that car park and allow you to walk to the distillery. It's 100 meters, 120 meters or something.
Yeah, but
so rather than coming and parking at the distillery, which you do at the moment.
Yeah, or walking around. If you go to the car park now, you basically walk into town, across a bridge, and then do you walk down the road, or is there a secret little passageway there somewhere?
No, you're right. That's exactly what it is. And the road doesn't have a pavement, so it's not. It's far from ideal. So at the moment, we have parking on the site. So you can park at the distillery. It is where, once I raise the next bit of funding, we'll build a second building there, which will have the gin still in it and a proper visitor centre. At the moment, we use the reception, and what is reception is also now a tasting room and a shop and reception, which is a bit of a shoehorn in, but that's the nature of startups, I guess. So the plans are big. I mean, I suppose the one piece that we're slightly different to a lot of distilleries is we've got very little hospitality. So the town of Ardara is a festival town. It's a town of hospitality. There's 4 or 5 places to eat. It's a village of like 400, 500 people, and yet you've got 4 or 5 restaurants. You've certainly got 5 pubs, 4 churches, 1 hotel, and any god's amount of bed and breakfast and other sort of hostelries. So it's a town that knows how to welcome and how to look after people. So the philosophy that we have is, we're here to kind of help people sort of come and see a working distillery, have a taste of our products, and then back into the town for if you want a coffee or a sandwich or all of those kind of things. I think we're not. Moira and I are definitely not hardwired to do that stuff. And I think if you're going to do hospitality, you better be good at it. And I don't think that's really our bag. We want to make exceptional whiskies and gins. That's our thing. And when you have a town as good as we have on the doorstep, then it's much better if we can get you walking out of your car, walking into us, and then walk back in to see. There's weavers, there's knitters, there's craft people, and there's any god's amount of tea, coffee, and something stronger if you want it. So.
Yeah. Well, and like I say, interesting in Donegal that 2 out of the 3 distilleries are right on the main drive. So it's just a straight shot, really, to get from one to the next. Liag is a little bit more, actually, that's a little hairy to drive out there because he's got a single-track road that has a lot of blind hills. So it's not the easiest place to get out to.
No, and I mean, we're very fortunate that the Wild Atlantic Way must be one of the best tourism, one of the best tourism type kind of plans, marketing strategies that you've. You're not going to believe this. True. I'm just going to turn this quickly for you. Can you?
Uh-oh. Now this is authentic. We have a sheep outside your door.
One of my sheep has escaped.
Oh no!
He's just walked up to the back door and just headbutted
it. He wants in.
He wants in. He's decided that there's a whiskey tasting and he wants to be part of it.
Give me that Silkie.
But it's So the Wild Atlantic Way as a concept, I think, has been amazing for tourism on the west coast of Ireland, and has really sold the idea of a wild, the Wild Atlantic, and and it tells a story really well. And we're bang on it, as you say. Crowley's bang on it. Carrick where Boliok is more difficult to get to, but worth the effort. And it's not really a tour. I mean, that's
right. That's a visit.
Go and sit with the owner and have a coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a much more personal, integrated kind of experience, I think.
That was really my challenge in putting together the book, because I said, okay, I have to figure out a dividing line between who is a distillery that you go to visit and they have a standard tour, you can book it online. So that ended up being my delineation. I said, okay, if you can book online, then I will put a 2-page profile in for you. If you can't, then, and this ended up being the 24 distilleries, so he's in there, but he's in there with a description of who he is. But since there's no way to really book online, it just kind of tells you, how to get in touch with him if you want to stop by and visit. And those kinds of distilleries, Killowen's the same. I say he is basically the Irish or the Ireland version of what Brendan is doing there at Killowen. It's just you're in a shed and you're kind of making some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's the difference between a visit. So there's a visit to a working distillery and there's a visit to Michael, right? Because that's what it is.
Yeah.
He happens to be in a working distillery, but it's you're visiting him. My cousin here has a hostel, and if I'm honest, you look at all the feedback. It's not about the hostel; it's about Sean, and I think that's that kind of delineation. And we actually you can't book online at the moment, but I've got a call on Monday with the software providers, so we will have online booking and stuff like that shortly. So, but I can imagine for you, there's understanding. There's because there's the kind of full on like Tullamore's experience, their new experience. Wow, that's massive. And it's kind of, I don't know how you do it in terms of a book, trying to put it together. So I'll wait. I'll know soon because you'll have done it for me.
Yeah, it was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge. So and part of the reason why I want to actually physically go to the distilleries, because that helps. But I mean, the idea is this is kind of opening up because Irish whiskey is just now opening up. So this book was, do I want to wait 3 years to wait till everybody is up and running and got their sea legs under them? Or do I want to give people a peek into what this thing is that's developing right now? And I mean, to me, the fun of traveling around Ireland was the opportunity. I'm going to put this into an analogy. When I like going down to watch spring training baseball in Florida. The reason I like going down to spring training baseball in Florida is because you get a chance to see the guys practicing. It's the early part of it's preseason. They're not really they're just stretching. They're going out hitting balls and just trying to get in shape for the season. And I like to go to the early part of that. And the reason I like going to the early part of that is because the baseball players have been away from the game for all winter, and they're excited to see fans come in, and they're like, this is what I am, it's a different experience. If you go later, they're already tired of signing autographs, and they don't really want to deal with you, and, they're kind of on their cell phones instead of, catching your eye and that sort of thing. So it's kind of the feeling I get about the Irish whiskey industry right now. It is so fresh and new that everybody I talk to is passionate, excited. They've got a story to tell, and you can't get that in Kentucky. I mean, you'll get a story in Kentucky, you'll get a story in Scotland, but it's just the rare distillery you go to that's brand new that's really starting to cut through, where you go, wow, the energy here is crazy. And that's the energy I'm getting from the Irish whiskey industry.
It doesn't surprise me, because I think the other thing is that you've got the vast majority of passion projects, and the founders are all still in it. And the reality is, some of us won't make it, and some of us will get bought out, and it'll all be so. So it is an interesting moment in time, because the majority of the businesses are still fundamentally kind of owner a founder owner kind of run, and probably a little bit sort of rough around the edges because of that. But that's all kind of part of the charm, I think, and part of what happens. In 3 or 4 years' time, there will be a whole, there will be a shakeout, which we all need to try and survive, and that shakeout will be, some guys will go to the wall, unfortunately, because I think that's the nature of it. I think the absolute number of distilleries probably stays the same. Whether it's all the same faces is probably a different question. And then there'll be a few that will be snapped up by guys looking to take, stakes, bigger companies looking to take stakes in Ireland, and whether they kind of go hard in it and just take things over, like Lochgill, where Sazerac have done that. But frankly, to realise the potential of Lochgill and that site, it takes a Sazerac or a William Grant's or someone like that to do it. And then so that's the kind of feeling I get anyway. And it's I think the absolute number of distilleries is probably the right number now, and it'll be interesting to see the kind of the faces and the relative scales of them over the time. That will be the piece that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I love the fact that you're doing peated whiskeys or turfed whiskeys or smoky whiskeys.
Yeah.
Smoky, I'm going to try to adopt that. It's like adopting the word pot still or single grain. Those are things that we got to kind of get into our speech patterns with Irish whiskey versus everything else. So,
It is, we're very lucky, really, to find this moment in time where ultimately the next, what's defined Irish whiskey today to so far is one thing. What defines it over the next 10 years, I think we're incredibly lucky to be in on that conversation and be part of the conversation and helping shape it. I think that's, to me, that's kind of fascinating. And it is kind of interesting because from an international perspective, we're in 40 countries at the moment and probably 41 states of the US. We just didn't really get a chance to be a baby. We because of that kind of passion for Irish that's there, we've kind of almost jumped straight into gangly teenager space. And the industry, I think, has probably done a little bit of that as well, because you've got this sort of the big players where everything is kind of known and understood and thought through and professional, and then there's the sort of all the noisy ones, wanting to sort of try and pull that agenda to somewhere different, or maybe just try and course correct a little bit, and all of that takes time, and I think it will be brilliant for it, So the fact that in Scotch, if kind of Diageo moves, or if Diageo moves and Grant's move and Pernod move, then the whole industry moves. It's as simple as that. Whereas Irish doesn't have that dominance.
Yeah.
So it's got to be it's
one big player, but the William Grant's is at Tullamore, but really it's hard to tell at this point. So they still feel fresh and new.
So you can. I certainly feel like there's going to be that the direction that we're going to go is still it's not sharp focus. It might be in focus, but it's not in sharp focus yet. And there's still a kind of, I believe there'll be a kind of chaotic, organic evolution of language, evolution of the technical file. Hopefully that isn't chaotic, because otherwise we'll never be thanked for it. But in terms of the kind of language around the industry, the kind of development in terms of where the industry seemed to go, no one really owns the rules in a way that say Diageo did with single malt, when it, Glenfiddich might have been the dominant style that kind of opened the category up, but sort of Diageo almost imposed the regionality piece, which may or may not be replicated here. I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see, and a real privilege to be part of.
Yeah, it's been fun watching Scotch whiskey actually break those barriers down. But the ones that are breaking it down are the smaller players, like the Ben Rayek, Glendronach. They're kind of push. Well, Glendronach's pretty much being what they are, but Ben Rayek is really playing around a lot. Lowland whiskeys playing around a little bit as well, and Isla whiskeys aren't all smoky, so there's these are the things that I love because it does challenge people's perception. And the reason why I focus on whiskey all over the world is because I want to see, these differences kind of growing in the different areas. There was a distillery in Ireland I went to that wants to make a sour mash whiskey. So, if we're going to stretch, let's stretch and see what we can come up with and just make whiskey better overall.
And it's interesting because if you think about Scotch, then it's kind of it's blurring the lines. So it kind of had very clear lines that were all defined, and now everyone's trying to blur them. And here, it's all blurry, and it'll come into focus. You know? And it's brilliant, and the opportunity that throws up for everybody is really is significant. And the important thing is that we do pull together. I think because if the industry kind of fragments, I don't think that's helpful at all to kind of maintaining the long-term strength and sort of health of the industry.
Yeah, find that middle ground between what Scotch whiskey industry is doing and anarchy.
yeah, that's it. Just find the middle ground. Just make sure it's a little bit closer to me.
Very good. Well, I'm going to let you go because your outdoor neighbor is giving you quite a bleeding. It sounds like
he is bleeding out the back here. So the gate up to the field is just around the corner here. So he's decided he wants out.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, James, I really appreciate you spending the time today and going through, and always a pleasure to talk to you, and we get onto some very interesting subjects, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys are going to come up with there and actually tasting the spirit that you guys produce on site. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you. No, I look forward to it, and thank you for the support with this. It's been really appreciated. So, look forward to seeing the book.
Thank you. Cheers. Sliabh.
Sláinte. Sláinte.